This is not a pick on the Catholics. It's just that they have such a clear global structure of authority that this makes it a really fascinating test case for whether or not your leaders need to believe the things that they're teaching you.
Welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And next on Pope Francis Says the Darndest Things.
And why it matters.
That's right. We are going to talk about Pope Francis. This has come up in a few different conversations, Nathan, but every time there are several people who just look at me wide-eyed and say, I have no idea what anybody's talking about right now. So let me just bring us up to speed just in case you missed it. But Pope Francis made some remarks in Indonesia, and they were off the record. He kind of departed from his script. But basically saying that the concern is that he was saying all religions lead to God. He essentially said every different faith tradition is like a different language.
Wait a second. Can you just read us the quote? Just read us the quote. Because you said it's being taken as if he said that, but if you read the quote, it kind of looks like that's exactly what he said.
Yes, it does. So here we go. Are you ready? And I quote, religions are like different languages in order to arrive at God, but God is God for all. Since God is God for all, then we are all children of God. And then he went on to say, quote, if you start to fight, my religion is more important than yours, mine is true and yours isn't, where will that lead us? There's only one God, and each of us has a language to arrive at God. Some are Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, Christian, and there are different paths to God. End quote. Yes. So this has been the occasion for some very serious confusion and some very serious concern. Mounting concern, you might say. I mean, let's give an understatement. Conservative Catholics have been concerned about Pope Francis from the start, and this is not helping.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Seems to be confirming some misgivings.
Is there a breakdown? Help me, Cameron, because I don't know enough about the Catholicism in the sense of like, is it so when the Pope speaks ex cathedra? When is that? So is that like everything the Pope says, or is that a very narrowly defined window of
very narrow? Yeah,
papal proclamation.
Yes, very important question. So and it has a direct bearing here.
Yeah, so there's that. On the flip side, sometimes people are like, well, that was off the record. Oftentimes we say what we really think off the record. So for me, that distinction doesn't clear anything up.
Well, let's just go back to ex cathedra just for a second, just in case some of you need to brush up on your Catholic history. And I am certainly not an expert, and there's a chance I may misspeak, so I'm going to actually be very guarded in what I say. But essentially,
we have helpful Catholics who listen and will straighten us out. So
who will straighten us out, and I'm counting on you. Help. Yeah.
Please
I'm
help.
Counting on you Catholic friends to straighten us out. Yes, please help. Send help. But basically, no, from my understanding, ex cathedra is narrowly defined to guard against just this kind of confusion. If the Pope makes a formal pronouncement in his capacity as the Holy See, then he is speaking infallibly. I think that would also include the publication of encyclicals. So those are formal pronouncements from the Pope. And so those are in a different category. These remarks are not ex cathedra remarks. So that's very important to point out.
But is it important to point out?
Let's linger here. That doesn't make you happy. Yeah, that answer I'm sensing. Or satisfy you, or you have some concerns.
I could see your local high school principal speaking as the principal of the school, saying, "Look, here are the positions that are in keeping with the laws of the state, and this is the policy that we're going to enact." And make a statement that way, and then off the record say, yeah, but personally, I really think we should have done the opposite thing because I think this would be better for our county. Okay, so you could have that, right? Where
Yep.
where one person is needing to abide by a larger set of laws and rules and parameters to say, okay, I'm subservient to this set of conditions, and this is what we've all agreed upon, and therefore this is the correct interpretation. I would imagine that our Supreme Court justices do this frequently, where they rule on something that they themselves personally would not be thrilled about, but they're like, this is actually the correct interpretation of law of the land is contrary to what I actually personally, maybe morally or religiously believe about something. So that we see this kind of double opinion happen all over the place. It's different though when you bring this into the religious sphere. So, I've joked about the time that I was visiting that church that had the awesome band, that I was there early. They were getting ready for the worship service, and then they stopped and all started yelling at each other. And the lady's like, "Oh, sorry about this. Like, none of these people are Christians. We just hire them in to do our worship music on Sunday mornings." And you're like, like, does that matter to anybody else, or like how, so for me, the in office, so it's not, the Pope doesn't have like, oh, and here's the world organization set of rules that I have to abide by even though I don't agree with him. you know it seems different. This seems different to me. Like, ideally I would think if you were, and by the way, hold on tight because I have some other things to say about non-Catholics in this whole realm as well. So this is not a pick on the Catholics. It's just that they have such a clear global structure of authority that this makes it a really fascinating test case for whether or not your leaders need to believe the things that they're teaching you.
Well, I want to press into that for just a second, Nathan, because you did point out that this is something that is common in the sense that you have certain jobs, certain vocations where the weight, the heft, I like the word heft, of a person's formal office supersedes their own personal beliefs. And those beliefs sometimes are subordinate to that office. Yeah, you mentioned it's easy. Yeah, you mentioned, I like the pointing to a judge is a good example.
Yeah, or let's take a police officer on the street who watches somebody commit a crime, is like, I think they're guilty.
Yep.
But they still are abiding by the whole legal due process of the whole thing. So their personal insight onto the matter needs to be subjugated to the overall rights of an American citizen.
Yes. And that's a very important example. And that's the right thing to do, by the way, as well. Because this is where, if somebody would say, now again, in an ideal world, but if you say the law, for instance, is sacred, part of what that statement is indicating is that, you may have, so look, let's say you may know that this guy did something, but the due process has to take place in order to honor the order of that society. If you don't, and if you try to violate that in some way, I mean, in a sense, in popular culture and entertainment, this is one area where I think superhero movies have grown up quite a bit because they all ask this question. They look at the ethics of vigilantism, essentially. And so so my point here, Nathan, is in lingering on this is I'm not so sure there is that big of a difference here with regard to Catholicism. To me, this looks like more of a difference in degree rather than kind. But you're saying that, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying since this is spiritual in nature or religious, this is in a bit of a different category for you. I'm curious about what you mean by that.
Okay, so you said that the police officer in this situation recognizes the sanctity of the system. That's the language you used. I'm saying this is the opposite of that.
The sanctity of the law. But system sounds so dirty
the system
these days.
But yes, sanctity
in ideal circumstances. Yeah.
In ideal circumstances, and let's all okay, we know the whole kerfuffle of how this goes sideways.
We don't live in an ideal, right.
We don't live in an ideal world. I'm saying this is the opposite. This is somebody who's saying that I speak on, like, I represent the sacred, even though I don't think that that's true personally. This is the reverse direction of that. Now, I mean, that sounds cringe to say it in reference to spiritual leaders. But
sure, but it's helpful. It's clear. Yep.
Let's put this in context though. You have and actually one of you friendly listeners sent a very nice email not so long ago. We were talking about this, the idea of no salvation outside the church. So Catholic doctrine, extra ecclesia nulla salus, something like that. Forgive my Latin. Which is saying that, by and large, throughout the majority of the past, that doctrine has been taken to mean that there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. This is how, read history, how, kings and princes and everybody else are kind of manipulated and doing the will of the church. Because if you don't do our will, we won't give you communion and then you'll go to hell. So that's the old school medieval version of that. The newer nuanced version of this is to say, well, you're saved by Christ if you're baptized, if you confess, and you receive the sacraments. So it's the salvation isn't through the church, but those sacraments can only be given by an ordained Catholic priest. So it's kind of salvation isn't just through the church, but it can only come through ordained priest within the church. So I don't want to get into the details of what different degrees of Catholics believe on different levels of that, other than to say that if you were a conservative Catholic, which I think the quote you're reading from there, Cameron, is from First Things. So consider the source.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm saying even if we were trying to read any kind of nuanced or context into what Pope Francis said there, it is a radical departure from the historical core. So we're neither of us are experts on this, and so we might be entirely wrong. But from a roughly theologically informed perspective, this is categorically different than anything we've heard ever.
And this is, just so you know, this is Charles. I'm not confident I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but Chaput, Chaput, who is the Archbishop Emeritus of Philadelphia. So this is he is himself a very learned and qualified spokesman on the matter. But essentially, he goes on to points this out, and he gets into very strong terms, Nathan, and says, basically the martyrs died for Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. And comments along these lines betray the blood of the martyrs. And I mean, these are his words here. So that points to, you use the word you use the phrase radical departure. That certainly bears that out there. And also, so let's talk about the off the cuff factor here, because I think that's important. So Nathan, you've said that often off the cuff remarks are highly revealing, and I would agree with you on that. Absolutely. I mean, I think this sounds like almost a sort of spiritual Freudian slip in that sense. But the other factor here is we live in a world where everything is always recorded now. So these kinds of nothing's really off the cuff anymore, especially if you're a figure of major stature, which of course the Pope is. And so going back to that ex cathedra distinction, okay, that's an important and valid distinction, but in some ways it's almost a mere formality these days, because just about anything Pope Francis says in any kind of public setting or any gathering or meeting is going to be recorded. And when something's recorded, or you have a transcript of it, there's a record of it, whether written or recorded, then it's going to feel for many people like a pronouncement. Even if it's not technically in an encyclical or something like that, it's still, here is the Pope speaking, essentially saying, unless we're completely misunderstanding him and we read you the quote, all paths lead to God. Everybody's trying to find salvation and everybody's working it out on their own terms, but eventually we all end up in the same place.
Okay, so let me give you a parallel to this.
Yeah.
Let me give you an alternative. Let me give you a parallel alternative story. Just I don't want it to feel like we're exclusively picking on Catholics here. So last week I was in a context with people who were extremely proud of themselves for being in the upper echelon of liberal Protestantism, who were recognizing that all their churches were collapsed and were almost seemingly delighted with it. it was a wild setting. And so
interesting.
yeah. Actually, you find out that basically within some of these theological movements, people think of like, well, the right is just reactionary against blah blah blah. But actually, when you get into the pure liberalism, like in the liberal Protestant sense, they actually don't have anything that binds them together either, other than their like hatred of Trump and evangelicals. So both extremes of our political spectrum are only galvanized around their disdain for something else. Not a lot of pure visioning coming out of either of those categories right now. So, professor from UC Berkeley speaking, perfect, fit the stereotype, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so I asked a question in the Q&A. I was like, so, you made a good link between evangelicals, and the Republican Party, and like that's hurrah, hurrah, jump on all their heads. Now we feel good about ourselves. Those silly people who believe in scripture and things like that. So you have that going on. And I said, I see the link there. I'm with you. I'm following, I'm tracking, I'm understanding your argument. I said, however, if I look at that, and because they were thinking that maybe liberal Protestantism will be able to pick up some of the evangelicals. And I said, when I look at the evangelical movement, the majority of the reason that people are leaving evangelicalism is not because of theology, but because of politics. So I said, what can liberal Protestantism offer someone that the Democratic Party can't?
Mm-hmm.
And so his response, it was along the lines of love, service, and brotherhood, right? Okay, so but keep the brotherhood in the back of your mind here, because I'm going to relate this back to the Pope Francis thing. So I said, yeah, okay, that's all kind of well and good, but follow-up question, it's a little bit vague, and look at me. And of course, this guy didn't have a clue who I was or, where I was coming from. So I was like, look at me, look at my generation. I was like, we're highly globalized, we're technologically, advanced and connected. I don't need Christianity to do love, service, and brotherhood. And he's like, oh, of course you don't need Christianity or the church to do it. He's like, no, love, service, and brotherhood, you can get that from, all sorts of things. He's like, no. He's like, some people will need Christianity to get there, but by and large, no, let 1,000 flowers blossom. Wherever it comes from is great. And I just sat there and it's like, but the difference here is that I was pretty confident that's what he believed. And his off the cuff remark was completely consistent with what he believed. So I appreciated the honesty of like, let's just call a spade here.
Yeah,
you actually don't think the church is necessary. And you're wondering why it's declining, but so those are two, the article you sent me at the same time I had this, liberal Protestant, excitement going on here. And I could see some distinct parallels and differences there at the same time. So there's the other form of, but the common thread across there is that one is brotherhood of all man shows up in both places. And that historically has been the theological buzzword, where you're more conservative leaning, theologically minded people would say, we worship God as our Father, and we see responding to the work of Christ as what makes us brothers and sisters. And so we don't believe in the childhood or the brotherhood of all humanity de facto, that what it means to be a child of God is not a natural born condition, but is something for the family of faith. And oddly enough, that's why people who have that vision can speak of sort of the familial nature of the people of God across denominations. And you'll hear them refer to Catholic, Baptist, whatever, brothers and sisters in Christ across that, because they're operating off of this framework of God as Father. And the plenty of scriptures you could, pull out your Bible and point to many of them that have that idea. So the shift is between, is the family of God everybody, or is it just the people who are rejoicing, celebrating, and receiving the work of Christ in their life? Those have historically been such massive theological landmines that it seems weird that the Pope would accidentally step on that if he didn't mean it. Like it's too big of a deal in too many theological circles to not, like, if you are the Pope, where that line is and
leads.
Right. I mean, like, in my mind, it's unfathomable that he could have accidentally said, we're all children of God, and not thought that would have had massive repercussions within the more conservative theological circles. That does not mean that God doesn't love everybody, by the way. that's just to be clear there on
sure.
the conservative theological position on that. But anyway, back to you, Cameron.
We need to honor proper distinctions. And there is a philosophical conversation there about how modernism, far from honoring diversity, actually leads to greater homogeneity. And so that sounds really abstract. Let me try to make that really clear. Think about a coexist bumper sticker. So this would be a popular culture. Yes, all of our favorites, right? Or now, if you want to get an updated one, the updated ones say tolerance with the same kind of iconography, woven into it. But what's that? So why are there certain select people who roll their eyes at that, or don't perhaps have enough eyes to roll at it? Well, because they recognize that you're jamming together things that have real crunchy fundamental differences between them. Doesn't mean that we all have to be at war with one another. Okay, so that's a separate issue. But saying that they're all the same is inaccurate. And that's why, I think the soundbite that sometimes is used is something along the lines of, there are superficial differences, but really fundamentally these are all the same. But in fact, it's the opposite. The superficially different faith traditions and religions may seem to be the same, religious, search for God or something greater than humanity. But if you press into the details, they're fundamentally different. I mean, there's a fundamental difference, for instance, between Islam and Christianity. Just talk to a devout Muslim and see what they think about Christ's incarnation. They have esteem for Jesus.
Let's look at the Middle East right now, or Muslims in India right now, and Hindu nationalism, and
Hindu nationalists, right? Exactly.
So that's the whole thing. Like that, I'm in the category of I do not have enough eyes to roll.
Hold on. Yeah, but hold on though. So to those who would say, wait, those are mainly, you're pointing to what are essentially political squabbles. Nathan and I think, would both say, no, that's a misunderstanding. They're not. Now they have political outworkings, but that's because these are public faiths. It doesn't mean they're purely political. So that's the misunderstanding of a lot of people who push forward an agenda of multiculturalism, for instance. The assumption is that really, at base, and this isn't totally fair, but it's kind of true when you press into the rhetoric of some of these people, really, fundamentally, all of us are essentially liberals in our hearts. And so we can bring our Islam and our Hinduism, and we can all, whatever it is, our Sikhism, and, into the cafeteria of different spiritual options. And if we just lay aside our political squabbles, we can all get along together. But they're not purely political squabbles. So Islam, for instance, we've talked about this before. If the core tenets
don't want to get along together, like you're assuming that these groups want to get along together,
right? But core tenets, meaning these are spiritual convictions with public political, and if they have public outworkings, then they will be political because they will affect the common life. So if a devout Muslim, wants to have a Sharia court set up in London, for instance, okay, that's motivated by religious convictions. It's also political, yes, but the politics are an outworking of those spiritual convictions. So these are real crunchy differences here. This is the world in which we find ourselves, and this is where so much of the modern world tries to push you in a direction that essentially flattens out all the real distinctions. So the hope there would be to just get a lot of really moderate or really liberal people who are really just at heart liberals, and maybe, have a few like some of the aspects of a particular religion, but don't really take it deeply to heart. Again, we don't spell it out in these kinds of terms, but that's right. And notice, by the way, this is an expectation leveled at Christians too. This is why I always liked Leslie Newbegin's phrase, the gospel is public truth. Well, if it's public truth, then it means it will have outworkings for the common good and the common life. Now, it happens to be the case that this is where the differences matter. Not all of these faith traditions respond equally to that challenge. Christianity is vehemently opposed to violence and coercion. Islam is not. Hinduism is not. And that matters. That actually makes a pretty big tangible difference.
But the danger comes when people are inconsistent, because there have been plenty of people who have done violence in the name of Christ. So we can like, inconsistency doesn't matter, or integrity doesn't matter. You're like, no, you better well believe it does. So here's
absolutely.
So let me run at this. Like, take what you said.
Important to say that. Yeah, thanks.
So, you the whole coexist thing. Yeah, it just comes across to me as phenomenally arrogant that I'm going to tell billions of people in the world that their belief system actually isn't what their belief system really is. It's amazing. Right. It's just shocking. And what I see in a lot of this liberal ambiguity theologically is a phenomenal level of privilege, where you're operating from this nice little bubble of everything is good and gooey in my life socioeconomically, and therefore the problems that other people have really fundamentally are access to healthcare. And so like there's this weird thing that happens within this, that you start to believe that people who are theologically conservative aren't interested in social issues or social action. And so but coming from where I live and dropping into those circles, you're like, wow, this group is so phenomenally out of touch with people who are seeking meaning in their life, who are feeling guilty because of atrocious things that have happened in their past, that are seeking forgiveness, that are looking for real community where they can be really known and really loved, who can really experience redemption and reconciliation and all these things that the gospel offers that none of these other systems even discuss. And so to lower and dissolve down Christianity into like, oh, it's just similar to, is first of all not even true academically, but then when you get to the practical outworkings of it, it's not even in the same category. And so this is not to say that I'm against coexistence, but I made a speech. You remember, Cameron, I've told this story before of at a college in Maine, there's a panel called Can We Coexist? So listen to this. I promise this is not a joke. So an imam, a Buddhist, an atheist, a lesbian rabbi, and Nathan Rittenhouse. I should say walk into a bar. And so the theme of the night was, just want to implicate myself in that. The theme of the night was, can we coexist? So I was the last one to go. Everybody gives their blah, 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 kind of. You get to the imam, and I love the Muslim guy. He's like, no. And he's like, and I think Sharia law is the best future for North America and for the state of Maine. And I'm like, that's right. Like, say what you think.
You know what?
Like,
good for him.
Yeah. No, we had the most productive conversation because I was like, yeah, it was. So there was no like, nobody was going to come back like, well, in his, off the cuff comments, he
let's
believed
nuance
consistently
that.
with what he
There's
believed.
no nuance.
Let's nuance it. Like, no. Yeah. So that was great. But then when it got to me, I said, I think coexistence is possible, but it's really a lousy goal. Because you're seeking mere coexistence and mere tolerance. And as a Christian, I believe that what God has for us in human relationships is the capacity to love one another. And that is our call. And I said, so if you guys are all comfortable with settling for coexistence, go play that game. But as a Christian, I have a higher vision of the possibilities of human relationships. And so that's why coexistence is possible, but it's a puny goal compared to the offer that Christ gives us. That was my summary of the night. But that's why. So you could say like, okay, Nathan, Cameron, why do you care so much about this? Well, why we care about it is because we feel like there's a better offer on the table through the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to try to water that down to make it seem like it's the same thing as something else that I find to be not meeting the needs of the deep longings of humanity in the religious, spiritual, and practical physical realm is, I'm not mad about it. I'm just sad.
I think this is a whole nother podcast, but there's another aspect to this conversation that we need to discuss. And we've hinted at it a little bit. Actually, you didn't hint at it. You talked about it, I think, most explicitly, Nathan, especially when you talked about your gathering of self-congratulatory progressives. And that is the church even necessary? So,
right.
Because outworking.
Well, that's what the guy said.
That's where you were going. So that guy said it's not. And if you have the Pope indicating all paths lead to God. We're working this out all on our own terms. And just to speak of, I mean, several conversations I've had recently, Nathan, in different gatherings actually, were along these lines as well. They weren't inspired by the Pope's remarks, but it was very much sort of church without walls kind of language. Yeah, well, really what we have here is so much more valuable at, some retreat center or, informal gatherings where people, are maybe have a stiff drink in their hand and they're talking about the Bible and arguing about it. You've heard this before too, Nathan. And the sentiment is what we have here is way more real, authentic than anything you would get in a social gathering like a church with a formal sign and its offices and all that structure, all that empty kind of tradition and all of that. What we have here is real and vital, and we don't. And yeah, I want to push back. I think I understand some of that. I want to push back against it vigorously as well, because I don't think that's the answer here. I think we do, in fact, need the church. I do think we can get carried away with some of the, operations of the church and all of that. But nevertheless, I mean, a church has to operate. This is where people often point to the book of Acts and say, well, did they have buildings back then? No, but give them a little time and they did. And I don't think it's bad that they did. And I mean, I was in one conversation where I said, yeah, no, Christianity had to have a little time to develop a culture. And it did.
They also didn't have hymnals.
There were some drawbacks. They didn't have hymnals, right? Yeah, exactly. But does that mean we shouldn't have any hymnals? Eventually they did. And eventually they did have a culture. And I think by and large, that's a very good thing. Of course, there are drawbacks. Human nature is fallen. We should expect that. But anyway, I think we're kind of out of time now. But I think that's another offshoot of the Pope's remarks right now. And I think that's a conversation that's happening a lot anyway. Why do we really even need the church? We can have spiritual. We can worship we can worship outside the church together, and it's more real. It's more honest.
Hang on a second. Okay. So this is thinking out loud here. So be gracious with me, all you listeners on fingers alongers here.
Here comes the heresy. Just kidding.
Yeah, probably. That the Pope is an element of his time here. And by how old is Pope Francis? He's older. It's a funny thing 90, that I see think, yeah. as I travel, that there is a more liberal conservative split generationally, with the older crowd being more liberal, specifically on this topic of like, why can't we all just get along? And so I think Pope Francis is a product of his time in that category of recognizing there has been real violence, there has been real tension. Way to go, Cameron's phone.
That's right.
There's a real memory of difficulty and tension there, and I can see the heartfelt desire to tone that down. On the other hand,
be conciliatory.
Be conciliatory. There's nothing. Blessed are the peacemakers. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. Although, if you have to contort truth to get peace,
do it at the expense of truth, we have a problem.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, I think we're coming like back into a moment here where, let's take American culture, for example. How many people have you heard in the last 3 months say, Republicans and Democrats are essentially the same? Like, it's pretty much the same group of people.
Right. Yeah.
Like, there's no real difference there.
Yeah.
So that kind of language is not making sense in any other category of our lived experience as humans right now. Where you say, the Palestinians in Gaza and the Jews in Israel pretty much are on the same path. Like, we just got, it's two sides of a different coin.
Yeah, but
nobody's saying that. So
why?
We're coming to a time.
This is very.
Well, let me finish this thought, and then
they believe
out here.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just to say that we're coming to a time in which people are now starting to say these cultures have been formed, and are making value judgments of like, and this actually practically is a better way to actualize the vision for the future of the country or the religious group or whatever, that we're starting to do comparative culture again in a younger isn't even the right word there. The 2016, 2020 plus, era is doing comparative culture now. of saying, yeah, we're comfortable saying this is better than this. But the church is like lagging on, is something happening culturally in like the time in which we live am I making, I'm not even making, I'm trying to make a point here.
You are making sense.
Our overall global culture has shifted
your point.
in our willingness to value cultures differently now.
No, your point is well taken because we're in cultural crisis here. Everybody agrees on that. What does that mean? Well, it means the social bonds are fraying. It means that we are seeing more and more, not just divisions, but I mean, real, true hostility and animosity. There's massive distrust of our institutions. But because we're losing that now, because we're losing some of that Western heritage, a number of honest intellectuals and there's a growing chorus saying, hey, we better be careful. If we lose it, look at other places globally. Look at China right now for an example of a secular society. Is that what you want? Or look at the Middle East. Do you want America to look like that? And so people are saying all people are of equal value to be esteemed, but not all nations are, not all political systems, not all faith traditions are made equal, because even Richard Dawkins is singing this song now. He's saying, I don't want England I don't want England under Islamic rule, because I believe the Western way of life is superior. We're finally at a point now where more and more people are saying that, and that is a big step. But you're right, we're still several steps behind in religious conversations. And what I wanted to point out there is the reason is we don't think of spirituality as real in the same sense that we do politics. We think politics actually make a difference and that they actually matter. Spiritual convictions, we still tend to have a very ephemeral view of it and think, well, it's, those are sort of heart value convictions. They don't really spill over, or at least they ought not to spill over into our everyday interactions. When in fact, of course, anybody who is a serious, devout, proponent of any religion, of course they will. It will have public outworkings. That's the way it goes. But yeah, we're definitely in a position now, especially in the West, because we're seeing decline. So we are in a position now to appreciate A, what we're losing, and B, to say, hey, there are certain things we don't want to become, because we believe that this way of life that we've had here, which is much more fragile than we had thought, is superior to other things that we don't want the U.S. to look like Mogadishu, for instance. And that's not a statement that's not devaluing the people there.
There's a guy who once said, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks.
He was onto something, I think.
He was onto something there. And what we're saying here is that the words that our spiritual and our political leaders utter matter. And whether they're posturing or speaking out of their heart, both of those are still out of a motivation of the heart that tells us something real about them. And they really do have real consequences. And we can point over there and say, spiritual leaders, political leaders, whatever. But really, I think the challenge here, Cameron, is am I the kind of person who, if I listen to my words, does it show me what I believe? If I look at what I'm putting my focus and attention on, it shows me what I believe. And so, once again, there's all this, happening global in Indonesia, whatever, but within my own heart of, do I have integrity between what I say I believe and what I actually believe and the words that come out of my mouth? And so for me, all of this is important. It's good to be aware of, and it's good to discuss. But the focal point is on my own integrity and who I am and what my words say about me. And I can work on that while I'm interested and concerned about some of these other realms. So yeah, let's not take ourselves off the hook here in this conversation as we plod along through watching what's happening in the world and trying to make sense of it. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.